Welcome to This Explainer. You know, as clinical coding professionals, we spend a massive amount of our time navigating the incredibly complex ICD-10-CM guidelines surrounding diabetes. I mean, how many times have you stared at a lengthy patient chart, trying to connect a systemic complication, like neuropathy or retinopathy, back to a primary diabetes code, feeling like you're just missing a piece of the puzzle? Well, here is the golden rule of medical coding. You simply cannot accurately code a disease process that you don't clinically understand. So today, we're setting a confident, authoritative foundation. Before we even touch a codebook or look at complication sequencing, we are going to master the underlying pathophysiology of diabetes so that everything else just falls perfectly into place.
Okay, let's dive into this. We are taking a fascinating macro to micro journey today. We'll start with an introduction and overview to lock down our definitions, then zoom in on carbohydrate digestion to see exactly where the raw materials come from. After that, we'll explore the hormonal regulation that governs the whole system before wrapping up with a quick summary and our next steps. All right, Section 1, Introduction and Overview. As I mentioned, we absolutely have to clearly, clinically define the problem we are looking at before we can even begin to abstract it from a physician's documentation. At its core, diabetes mellitus is a chronic metabolic disease. It's not just a temporary spike in blood sugar. It is a long-term fundamental failure of the body's energy regulation system. The defining characteristic, really the massive red flag that drives all the subsequent systemic damage we eventually code for, is persistently high blood sugar, clinically known as hyperglycemia. When you're looking at a patient's chart and it documents years of cascading health issues, well, it all traces back to this single chronic metabolic failure. To really grasp this, we need to look at the delicate balance of the system, which brings us to the two primary types of diabetes. Think of this as a basic supply and demand issue. In type 1 diabetes, the pancreas simply does not produce enough insulin. It's an absolute insulin deficiency. The factory is literally broken. Contrast that with type 2 diabetes, where the body cannot effectively use the insulin it's actually producing. This is driven by insulin resistance. So the factory is pushing out the product, right? But the body cells are just stubbornly refusing to open their doors. Understanding this specific mechanical difference is the absolute foundation of why our E10 and E11 ICD-10-CM code families are separated the way they are. Let's move on and see how this builds in Section 2, Carbohydrate digestion and glucose absorption. Because to understand why blood sugar gets so high in the first place, we first need to understand how glucose actually enters our systemic circulation. We're going to trace the physiological flow of a single carbohydrate as it's ingested and broken down, step by step, right through the gastrointestinal tract. You can think of this journey as a factory assembly line running in reverse. We're breaking things down rather than building them up. This chronological journey spans 4 main stations: the oral cavity, the stomach, the small intestine, and finally, the large intestine. The whole process kicks off right in the oral cavity. Here we have ingestion and mastication, which is just a fancy way of saying eating and chewing. But hey, it's not just a mechanical breakdown happening here. Fun fact, digestion actually begins the exact second saliva hits your food. Saliva contains an enzyme called salivary amylase, and this immediately starts chemically shearing those complex starches down into shorter polysaccharides before you even swallow your first bite. Following the food down the GI tract, it hits the stomach. Now, the stomach's highly acidic environment actually inactivates that salivary amylase we just talked about. So carbohydrate digestion hits a brief pause. But the real heavy lifting, that happens next, in the small intestine. Here, pancreatic amylase joins the fight, along with specialized brush border enzymes, things like sucrase, maltase, and lactase. These enzymes are totally crucial because their sole purpose is to break disaccharides down into monosaccharides. And that is the actual usable glucose our body absolutely craves for energy. Finally, whatever is left over moves into the large intestine, where fiber and indigestible carbohydrates are fermented by bacteria into short-chain fatty acids. All right, moving on to Section 3, hormonal regulation. Once those monosaccharides we just talked about are absorbed through the intestinal walls and enter the blood as glucose, our body relies on 2 primary natural hormones to regulate them and maintain homeostasis. These 2 vital peptide hormones, both produced by the pancreas, by the way, are in a constant state of physiological tug-of-war. Insulin's job is to lower blood sugar. It acts exactly like a key, unlocking the body's cells to allow glucose to enter for immediate energy. It also takes any excess glucose and stores it as glycogen in the liver and skeletal muscles. We call this process glycogenesis, literally making glycogen. Glucagon, on the other hand, works in direct opposition. When blood sugar drops way too low, glucagon raises it by signaling the liver to break that stored glycogen back down into glucose. That process is called glycogenolysis. So one stores energy, the other releases it. It really is a perfect balancing act. And this brilliantly illustrates that exact endocrine feedback loop in action. It's an incredibly elegant automated system. High blood glucose triggers the beta cells of the pancreas to release insulin, which drives glucose into the fat cells and liver, returning the blood to normal levels. Conversely, low blood glucose triggers the alpha cells of the pancreas to release glucagon. This tells the liver to release its stored glucose, which, again, returns the blood to a normal level. As long as this loop functions, the body stays in perfect homeostasis. But what happens when that elegant system actually fails? Well, think about a healthy, normal pancreas producing adequate insulin, successfully moving all that glucose out of the blood and into the cells. Now, compare that to the diabetic state. The pancreas is producing less insulin, meaning way fewer keys are available. Because of this, you get a massive buildup of excess glucose trapped right there in the bloodstream. This persistent hyperglycemia is exactly what acts like microscopic glass in the blood vessels, eventually destroying the kidneys, eyes, and nerves. And that leads directly to the complex manifestation codes you assign every single day. Which brings us to our final section, the summary and outro. We really need to lock this foundational physiological knowledge in place before we move on to our future lessons on these specific coding guidelines. To summarize our macro to micro journey today, we established right away that diabetes mellitus is defined by persistent hyperglycemia. We then traced how carbohydrates are broken down from the mouth all the way down to the large intestine to supply that glucose. And finally, we mapped out that delicate endocrine tug-of-war where high blood glucose triggers beta cells to release insulin, while low blood glucose triggers alpha cells to release glucagon. Understanding this cellular etiology directly dictates your ICD-10-CM coding logic. Master the pathophysiology, and you will absolutely master your clinical coding accuracy. But now that we know exactly how diabetes breaks the body's systems, how do we actually translate those specific systemic failures into the correct combination codes? Well, that is exactly what we'll tackle in part 2. Thank you so much for joining me today, and please like, share, and subscribe to Decode Healthcare with Harshal.